That's a joyful noise right there. So I don't know if you guys. No, I want neither. Thank you. I wanted one of them, but then my iPad wasn't working. I haven't used my iPad in so long, and I tried to get it to work, and it didn't. So I don't know if you've ever had that when you've been like giving a presentation at school and the technology is like not working, and so no matter what, you're just immediately stressed. That's kind of where I'm at now, but it'll be fine. It'll be fine. So, I don't know about you guys, but I was reading this essay from a woman named Clay. Now, that's the signal. Okay, so I don't know about you guys, but I was reading this essay from Jacqueline Woodson. She's an author, and it was the essay was about like race. She's a black author, and she was talking about writing stories for people of color, by people of color. That's what she was talking about. But in it, she said something that anybody can relate to. She said that when she goes to her grandma's house, they speak their own language, they have their own traditions, and nobody else who's in anybody who's not in the family just wouldn't really be able to get it. And that's probably the case for you if you have grandparents and you go to their house. We have stories that we pass down through our family, and regardless of if we've seen each other a week ago or we haven't seen each other since Christmas, whenever we get together, those stories are going to come up. I don't know if you have stories that you pass down through your family, but here's a couple of examples of mine. Every time we get together with my mom's family, no matter what, we share the story of when my uncle pointed out on the car, he said, "Hey, is that bird poop on the car?" And my grandma took her finger, ran it through the bird poop, licked it, and said, "Yes, that is bird poop." As if it was no big deal at all. Whenever we get together, we share the story of Dixie running her finger through the bird poop, because that's just what we do, okay? There's another story that comes up every time my family gets together. This one involves me, which is why I'm going to share it. I got home late from work one night. I think I was working at the mall at the time, and I'm pretty sure it was the holidays, so I got home later than usual. And my parents' bedroom was on the main floor, and it was pretty normal for my mom to sleep with the bedroom door open because her room got really hot and stuffy at night. So I get home, and I hear my mom kind of like wake up, and she's kind of like in that half awake, half asleep sort of thing, and she says, "Who's there?" I'm like, "Well, she's half asleep, and and it's pretty late, like I don't want to like wake her up or anything." So I just didn't say anything, and I started to go downstairs. And then I hear these infamous, iconic words that my family loves to share whenever we get together. She says, "Intruder, reveal yourself." Which is just so good. Just so good to me. I did not know how to respond to that. And here's why. If I reveal myself, then I am admitting that I am in fact an intruder, which I am not. This is my home. But if I do not reveal myself, then I'm behaving as an intruder would, because surely an intruder would not reveal themselves if my mom demanded it, because they are criminals and bad people. So I found myself in a pickle, and I decided to do what any good son would do, and I went straight to bed and then roasted my mom about it eternally, forever, still to this day, roasting her about it whenever I can. Intruder, reveal yourself. So good, so good. So today, as we conclude our You're Not Alone series, the series that we've been in this month, I want to share with you a very famous story that has been passed down by a family from generation to generation to generation. But it's not like my family stories, which have been passed down for, the last 40 or so years. Instead, this is a story that's been passed down for thousands of years. And it's a story about somebody who saw others that were alone and in distress, and they decided to do something about it. God used this person to be a hero. And this month we've shared a lot of epic stories about God heroically showing up and proving that to people that they are not alone. Joseph, for example, in our first week, found himself alone in a pit. And then he found himself alone in a prison. But God brought him to the palace of the Pharaoh, and he was able to save his people. Job was alone in the ashes of his once healthy, happy life for days and days and days. For like 7 days, he knelt in the ashes of his home that had been burned to the ground, where his children had died. Okay? And then God showed up, and God revealed to him that he had never left him, and that he never would. And then last week, we saw a demon-possessed man who had been isolated from everyone that he knew and he loved, and he had been isolated by the enemy. And Jesus literally came to his island and freed him. Jesus literally came to him and released him from his bondage that he found himself in, and he let this man know that he was not alone. And now today we get to see how God can use us as well to show others that they are not alone. In these first 3 stories, we've seen God come to people and meet them where they're at. Meet them in the prison. Meet them in the ashes. Meet them on the island, in the cemetery, naked and in bondage, right? Last week's story was crazy. Okay, we see God coming and meeting them where they're at. But now we get to see God using somebody to meet others where they are alone. And I wonder if you have ever seen other people who seem alone. We've talked a lot about how sometimes we feel alone. We've talked about how we feel isolated. We've talked about how we've been made to feel alone by lies of the enemy or by the struggles that we find ourselves in, and we're like, nobody else could be going through this. But I'm willing to bet that you know people who are in need, but nobody seems to be doing anything about it, or nobody knows how to do something about it. Perhaps you have a coworker who's told you, they're like, I'm at my wit's end. I don't know if that's something that people say, but maybe they do. Maybe you have a coworker like that. Or maybe you have a cousin or a brother or sister or a teammate who's indicated that they don't really have a lot of friends or a lot of community. Maybe you have a classmate who has been rejected by their family, and now they're very lonely. I don't know if this is the case for you, but I'm willing to bet that you know somebody like this, and I'm willing to bet that perhaps at some point in your life, you have been that person. So the story that we're going to be looking at today is a story about how you can be there for somebody else. And the hero that we get to look at today is a woman named Esther. Okay? And she witnessed people who felt alone and felt powerless. And she knew people who were alone with nowhere else to turn. And God used her just like he might use you. So we need to learn 4 people for this story. So I'm gonna lay it out for you. Esther's a very unique book in the Bible. I actually want to start here. Okay, it's very different. It's different for a few reasons. First of all, it's written very literary. Okay, it's a piece of like classic literature almost. It's got a very easy to follow plot. Have you ever read the Bible and you're like, I don't really know what's happening? Have you ever felt that way? It's kind of confusing. Okay, Esther's not that at all. There's like a beginning and a middle and an end, and there's a very clear plot, and there's only 4 main characters, and it's very, very nice to read. But here's what's interesting about it outside of that, okay? Esther, the book of Esther is the only book that doesn't even mention God, which is kind of weird. Every other book in the Bible actually mentions God, but Esther does not, okay? Esther is a very interesting book because it takes place hundreds of years after the Babylonian captivity, when all of the Jewish people had gone back to Israel. They had gone back to their homeland, but Esther follows a group of Jewish people that decided to stay and not go back home. So it's a really interesting book, and here are the 4 characters that you need to know. The first one is Esther, okay? You need to know her. She's the main character. She's the one that God uses in this story, okay? Esther has a cousin named Mordecai, who's a really, really good dude, and he's the one who raised Esther. You need to know him, okay? You need to know the king. There's a king named King Xerxes, okay? He's the king of Persia, and he's a very, very powerful man. In fact, he's regarded in his kingdom as the King of Kings. Jesus would later on claim that title, but it comes from Persia, okay? And then finally, you've got a guy named Haman, and he's the bad guy. Everyone just give a thumbs down so we know, okay? It's a very, very clear story. There's the good guys, Mordecai and Esther, and there's the bad guy, Haman. Okay, and when this story has been passed down from generation to generation, it's been very clear who's good and who is bad. Okay, in fact, when it gets told like this, oftentimes people will cheer when Mordecai comes up, and they'll boo when Haman comes up. Okay, so feel free to do so if you want. That is totally fine. Okay, so let's set the scene. Okay, so King Xerxes is a very, very powerful king of Persia. and he resides in his capital city of Susa. And King Xerxes decides that he's going to throw a banquet, a huge banquet for 187 days. He's going to party for 187 days straight. That's longer than some of you have been alive, I'm pretty sure. Okay, it's a very, very long party. Okay, does that math check out? I think it does. Okay, so it's this huge long party, and towards the end of it, people are. It's kind of starting to die down. I don't know. This is day 100. How long? When does a party die down at that point? Okay, but he's getting towards the end of it, and he decides he's like, you know what this needs? This needs some women. Okay, so he sends for his queen. It's a woman named Vashti. Okay, Queen Vashti, and he sends for her, and she refuses to come before the king. She's like, I'm not coming. I'm not interested in coming and hanging out with you tonight. And he gets really mad, and so he's like, okay, you're not the queen anymore. I need a new queen. And so he holds a fashion show, a beauty pageant, and decides to parade some of the women from the city before him, and he's going to select his next queen, okay, from this group, okay? He's going to marry many of them, but only one can be the queen, okay? And so Esther ends up in this, okay, the cousin of Mordecai. Okay, yeah, we're going to cheer for the hero. There we go. Okay, that's great. So she ends up in this pageant, okay, and she ends up being selected, and she is chosen to not only be one of his wives, but to be his queen. He is infatuated with Esther. He thinks she's amazing. Okay, so she is now the queen of Persia, married to Xerxes the king. Okay, but Mordecai tells her... Mordecai tells her to hide her nationality, okay? It's not easy to be a Jew living in a foreign land. This was historically true, and it has continued to be true up until the modern times, actually. It's a little bit dangerous when you're a Jewish person. They live differently. They often would not intermarry, so what Esther was doing was actually kind of outside the bounds of what the norm was for the Jewish people, and they often had enemies. Okay? So, while this is going on, we have another kind of subplot going on with this guy, Haman. Okay? Haman was selected by the king to be basically the second in command of Persia. He had received a lot of power. And he issued a decree where anyone who ever saw him had to bow down to him. Okay? They had to bow down to him when they saw him. Now, Mordecai worked at the city gate, or at the palace gate, okay? And Haman would pass by him every single day, and every single day Mordecai refused to bow down to him, okay? He does have some self-respect. Now, this bothers Haman, and Haman actually makes a decision. He says to himself, I will not just be happy with making Mordecai suffer for this, I want to make all of the Jewish people suffer for this disrespect. Okay, so he goes to the king, King Xerxes. Xerxes is kind of impressionable. He kind of believes whatever anyone tells him. It seems like he's often intoxicated in the story. He's always drinking and partying and having these banquets. So he goes before King Xerxes. Haman does, and he says, there's these Jewish people living in your land, in all 127 provinces, and they should be destroyed. So let's issue a decree that, and he rolls some dice, okay? He casts lots for the day, and he says, on this day, it translates to be like the 7th of March, okay? But it was different in the Hebrew calendar. He says, on this day, we will destroy all the Jewish people. And the king's like, we need to do this? And he's like, yes, we need to do this, okay? And the king says, all right, if you say so, you are the second in command, and I trust you, okay? So on the 7th of March, all the Hebrew people throughout the land will be destroyed. And if you kill them, you get to take all of their property. Okay, so there's incentive in it as well. Not only should the people do this because the king is saying so, but you get something out of it. And so Mordecai hears about this, and he begins to get very upset, knowing that not only him, but all of his people are going to be destroyed, and there's nothing that he can do about it. Once the king in the Persian Empire makes a decree, it cannot be taken back at all. Even the king cannot take back his own decree. That is the law. So once this was issued, that was it. It was going to happen. So Mordecai tears his clothes in anguish, and he begins to wear burlap sackcloth, basically, because he's in this period of mourning. And then as the decree goes out to all 127, I think that's how many provinces there are in the Persian Empire, all of the Hebrew people, all of the Jewish people start to do this. And word makes its way to Esther, okay, the queen. And she hears that Mordecai is in anguish, and she does not know why, okay? So I'm going to read this. Esther chapter 4, verses 1 and 3. This is how the Jewish people responded. When Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap and ashes, and went out into the city, crying with a loud and bitter wail. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. And as news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, they wept, and they wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. So word gets to Esther about this, and she realizes that her people are alone. Her people are suffering, and they don't know where to turn. They don't know what to do about it. They are on their own. Literally, everyone else in the empire is now their enemy, because there's something to be gained by destroying the Jewish people. Not only is it a decree from the king, but also you get something out of it if you kill them. They are literally and utterly alone, okay? It was everyone against the Jewish people. Who cared and who would come to their aid? That became the question. Maybe you, in your life, have felt like you were on your own against extraordinary odds before, where you are overwhelmed, where it makes you want to cry and wail and tear your clothes. But Esther, in the palace, hears about this, and she uses a messenger and sends him to Mordecai to ask what's going on. So the messenger goes to Mordecai, and Mordecai responds and sends the messenger back, and it goes back and forth, and it must be very busy for this messenger who has to carry every single message because they can't see each other. She can't leave the palace, he can't enter, okay? And so Mordecai asks Esther for her help, and she is very afraid. She's afraid because of what happened to the previous queen when she disobeyed the king, when she disobeyed King Xerxes. But Mordecai then says this, and this is, I'm going to share what he says, but I want you to understand another law. There's another law that existed where if the king did not send for you and you entered his private chambers, you could be killed. If he doesn't respond to you, then you'll be killed. If he points his scepter towards you, that means you will be spared. But she was taking her own life into her hands by going before the king to ask him to do something about this law. And so she's very afraid to do so. But Mordecai says something very big. And this is like the famous verse from Esther. You've maybe heard it before. This is what he says, chapter 4, verse 14. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. Okay? Now, God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, but you can kind of see it here, right? He says, we'll be delivered. We will be saved. I have faith that we will be saved if you don't do anything. But you and your relatives will die. And then he says the very famous line from Esther. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. Maybe this is why you are the queen of Persia, Esther. Maybe it's for this moment. Maybe this is why you became queen in the first place. Maybe this was, and he's not mentioned, but maybe this was God's plan. Whatever Esther chooses to do, God will deliver. But maybe this is why she is where she is. And maybe this goes along with your story as well. Maybe you were made a volleyball player for such a time as this. Maybe you were made a trumpet player, or an actress, or a barista, or a swimmer, or an epic gamer. I don't know. Maybe you were made who you are for such a time as this. Maybe you were even made to be a hero, the way that Esther was. But the question is, will you do it? Okay? God wants to send you to the lonely to be a comfort. God wants to send you to be a friend. But will you go? it might cost you something. In the instance of Esther, it might cost her her life. But for you, it might cost you something different. It might cost you your time. It might cost you some money. It might cost you your reputation to be going to that kid, to that person, and being their friend. But Esther went. Esther chapter 5, verses 1 and 2 say this. On the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out his gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. And then the story gets to add some dramatic irony, which you might like. He says, Esther, what is it that you want? What is it? I'll give you anything. Even if you want half the kingdom, I'll give it to you. And she's like, whoa, king, I just want to invite you to dinner and bring Haman with you. So Haman and the king go to dinner with Esther. And the king's like, all right, I'm tired of waiting. What is it? What is it that you want? And she says, hold on. Let's do dinner tomorrow night, and I'll reveal why I've done all of this. One more dinner, just the three of us, a special dinner. And the king says, agreed. And Haman goes home drunk and excited, very happy with what's going on. And he goes home and he tells his wife and his friends, he says, things are going well for me. Things are great. He says, I've been invited to this royal dinner with just the king and the queen, and I have no doubt that the future is looking bright. But I passed I passed Mordecai on the way home, and he didn't bow to me. I can't be happy while he still lives. He's like, what will I do? And so he decides to have a giant spike made. And he's going to have Mordecai impaled on it. And he's like, tomorrow, I'll go and I'll ask the king if we can kill Mordecai. Okay? That's when we really boo, right? Boo. He's like, I want to kill Mordecai tomorrow because I'm just sick of it. Okay? So, what he doesn't know, but what we know as the readers, dramatic irony, right? We know more than the characters do. But what we know is that the king could not sleep that night after dinner with Esther. He couldn't sleep at all. All he could think about was, I don't know, kingly things, I guess. So he has a servant come in and read to him the royal record. He's like, tell me about my rule as king. And so the servant starts reading the royal record. And the servant gets to this moment from long before when Esther first became queen. And Mordecai overheard some servants of the king plotting to assassinate him. Mordecai told Esther, who went and told the king, and Esther gave credit to Mordecai, and the king was saved. And Mordecai was a hero of the realm. And the king asks, he says, what did I do for Mordecai after he saved my life? And the servant said, there's nothing in the record, sir. I don't think you gave him anything. And the king said, I will fix that tomorrow. So the next day, while the king was thinking about what he could possibly give for someone who saved his life, a hero like Mordecai, Haman entered. And the king said, Haman. That was a good move. That was good. Good timing, okay? He said, Haman. Now, Haman's planning to ask if he can kill Mordecai. But the king asked, Haman, what would I do for someone who I wanted to honor? Someone who I love. Haman, thinking that he could be talking about no one but him, said, well, if I were in the king's position and I wanted to honor somebody, I would give him the king's robe and a horse that the king had ridden on, and I would parade him through the streets saying, this is what the king does for those who he honors. And the king said, perfect, I want you to do that for Mordecai today. And so Haman put Mordecai on a horse, gave him the king's robe, and marched him through the streets, proclaiming, this is what the king does for those whom he honors. Then the king sent for him for dinner with Esther. Now Mordecai is fuming, but his plan is still in action. About a year from now, all of the Jews in the land will be killed, including Haman. So he can wait. It'll be okay. And so he enters into the banquet, and the king says, all right, I'm tired of waiting. What is it? And Esther says, my king, this man, pointing at Haman, this man plans on killing all of the Jewish people, of which I am one. The king says, is this real? And she says, yes, I am a Jew. And he goes on a walk because he's so upset. He has to go walk it off. And when he leaves, Haman immediately throws himself onto the couch on which Esther is reclining, and he begs for his life, knowing that the king plans on killing him. And he begins pawing at her, begging her. And the king enters and he says, "You would kill my wife in front of me?" Thinking that he's trying to kill Esther. And he asks his servant, "What do I do with Haman?" And his servant says, "Well, Haman actually erected this giant spike that he was going to kill Mordecai with. You could kill him on that." And the king says, "All right." And he does so. The story doesn't end there, though. That's often what you hear. But the king can't undo a law that he has made. So he brings in Mordecai and he brings in Esther, now heroes, right? And he says, "What do we do about this law?" And Mordecai writes a new law that says, on that same day, March 7th, whatever it is on the Hebrew calendar, it's something of Adar, that's the month. He says, on that day, all of the Jewish people will be called by the king to unite together to defend themselves from their enemies. And they will be required by law to do so. So when the day came, all of the Jewish people were already united together, and they defeated their enemies. They killed all of the sons of Haman, who tried to get revenge, and they killed hundreds of other enemies all throughout the kingdom. And it was so successful that the king actually extended it by one day. Because he was like, it seems like the Jewish people have a lot of enemies. Do they need another day to do so? It seemed that they did. And so they had one more day where they were able to defeat their enemies. Okay? And that is where today you get the Feast of Purim, which comes from the word to cast lots, because Haman randomly chose the day where he would destroy the enemies. And so they reclaimed that, and there is now a feast that is still celebrated today. And that story is told on that day of when Esther and Mordecai saved all the Jewish people, people who seemed as though they were very alone. Now, God is not mentioned in that story once, but I think his presence is felt all throughout it. God placed Esther exactly where he did for a reason. God placed Mordecai exactly where he did for a reason. And he might have done the same with you. There might be people in your life who you are being called to be there for. Okay? Stories are passed down for many reasons. Sometimes stories are really funny. Sometimes stories are quite sad. Sometimes stories are dramatic. This story seemed to be all three of those things, right? But there's something else in the story of Esther. There's a lesson for us about how God will use us if we let him, and about how God's always there, even if he's not fully mentioned, even if he doesn't get tagged in it, right? He's still there working. And that's what I want you to take away from this story. Esther went and she helped those who seemed as though they were totally alone and who had nowhere else to go. And one day, that might be you who hears about somebody in need, and then you can remember that maybe you were made for such a moment as this, just like Esther was. Your friends may feel alone, but God will use you to prove those friends wrong. Let's pray and then we'll split up. Dear Jesus, thank you for tonight. Thank you that even when we can't see it, even when we're not fully aware of it, that you are working, you are in action, and you are orchestrating things for your glory, God. I pray that whenever we see somebody who they're in the pits, they're in the cemetery, they are in the ashes, they are in need, that we can be there for them, that we can be there for the Josephs, the Jobs that we find in our lives, God, just like Esther was. And that even though it might cost us something, that we will take that risk. Just like Esther said, if I perish, then I perish. I pray that we have that desire to help others, and that we will do so, God, that we will go wherever you